How can we build a society where the power of freedom isn't a privilege for the few, but a reality for everyone? Welcome to Future Hindsight, where we take big ideas in civic life and democracy and turn them into action items for you and me. Because democracy is not a spectator sport. Tomorrow starts right now. I'm Mila Atmos. For generations, we've been told freedom and equality go hand in hand in American democracy. And yet, profound inequality in power, wealth, and status has fundamentally broken that promise. Today, my guest is Zakaras, professor of political science at the University of Vermont and author of Freedom for All: What a Liberal Society Could Be. Professor Zakaras argues for what he calls radical liberalism, a tradition rooted in abolition, labor organizing, and civil rights that demands we extend genuine freedom to everyone on equal terms. I want to know what freedom for all really requires, how citizens can build the collective power to achieve it, and whether our democracy can deliver on its most fundamental promise. So come along with me as we find out. And before we start, thanks to Shopify for supporting Future Hindsight. Shopify is a platform designed for anyone to sell anywhere, giving entrepreneurs like myself the resources once reserved for big business. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful. And if you want to support Future Hindsight, subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's easy and free and a great way to build your civic action toolkit every week. Head to youtube.com/Future Hindsight to subscribe after this episode. Welcome, Alex. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So let's start with the basics. What are the goals that we should be pursuing as a democracy?
As a democracy, well, and I would say as a liberal democracy in particular, one of the most important goals we ought to be pursuing is the aspiration to empower everybody in our society to live freely. That's long been one of the highest aspirations of liberal societies and liberal democracies everywhere. And as you said in the introduction, it's an aspiration that's been betrayed substantially in our society over the last 4 or 5 decades.
So you argue that radical liberalism demands meaningful equality. And I think most people, when they hear radical liberalism, they think, quote, more left, which is so abstract and also doesn't really mean anything. And the way that I understand your argument is that when radical liberalism delivers on its promise, we all have equal freedom. In concrete terms, what's an example that we can all point to? Like, aha, that's what equal freedom looks like in action.
Do you mind if I step back for a moment? Because when we use the term liberalism, I always want us to start by talking about what that term means, because there's a fair amount of confusion, to be honest. When we use the term liberal in ordinary political conversations, we're often just describing people who are left of center, right? So the more liberal you are, the farther you fall to the left. And that's actually not the meaning of the term that I'll be using today. When political scientists and historians use the term liberalism, they're really talking about a political persuasion or outlook that's unified by a shared goal on the one hand and a shared set of political strategies on the other. So this will get a little more concrete. The shared goal is this abstract thing that we call freedom, right? Liberals have long aspired to create conditions under which people can live freely, and they've really emphasized personal freedoms above all. So the freedom to speak and worship, the freedom to love who you want to love, the freedom to associate, the freedom to own property and to work and such. And where it gets more concrete is in the list of strategies that liberals have tended to employ to achieve that goal. And these include constitutions, individual rights overseen by independent judiciaries, the rule of law, democratic accountability, checks and balances, a free media, a market economy. All right, so understood in that way, liberalism is a fairly big tent political tradition, right? It includes people on the right like Ronald Reagan, and it includes people on the left like Franklin Roosevelt. Now, the liberalism that I defend in the book, and you're right in calling it radical liberalism, that's the term I describe, is very much a liberalism in the tradition of FDR. But it's important to see that that's only one sort of version of liberalism that's available to us.
Right. It's a deeper, more expansive liberalism that really addresses inequalities in a way, I would say, that is more robust. But so tell us about what that kind of equality looks like if we had radical liberalism among us. And in some instances, it does exist, I think, in some corners in the United States. And so what's a really good example where people can, viscerally understand what is it that we are pursuing here?
Yeah, it's always helpful to try to bring these abstract terms down to concrete reality, right? So one way I would try to do that is by focusing on the idea of freedom. The idea of freedom is really about the power to make choices. All right. So we're free to the extent that we have the power to shape our lives in ways that are important to us. And when you define freedom in that way, it's just very clear that having, for example, access to affordable healthcare, not having to pay an extraordinary amount for rent so that you have money left over to do other things in life, having access to affordable childcare, being paid a livable wage. These are all the sorts of things that are going to expand your range of options. Right? When you don't have those things, right? When you're cost burdened, not earning enough money to make basic ends meet, when you're living paycheck to paycheck and worried constantly about where the money's going to come from to cover your next medical bill, to cover your next rent payment, there's so much that you can't do in life, right? Your range of options is tremendously constrained. So one of the things that radical liberalism is about is trying to reverse some of the profound inequalities that you mentioned at the top that have widened in our society over the last 4 and 5 decades, expand opportunity for working people and allow people to have the resources and opportunities they need to actually make choices in their lives.
Yeah, I want to go over that as a democratic strategy, what people can do, right? Because we are a democracy show. But before we get there, I wanted to do another theoretical question. You argue in your book that radical liberalism depends on democracy and that there is a mutually reinforcing relationship between the two. And I have a question about where you see the evidence of this relationship and what that means in practice. Like, how does democracy enable radical liberalism? And how does the pursuit of equal freedom strengthen democracy in turn?
Those are terrific questions. And this is something I think liberal thinkers have not emphasized enough. And that is, when you look at the major gains that have been made in our history, that the gains that have expanded rights and freedoms for working people significantly, or have expanded rights and freedoms for minority populations significantly, what you almost always see is sustained periods of popular mobilization. So if we think about the decades of labor activism and popular mobilization that led up to the New Deal, or if we think about the decades of civil rights activism and popular mobilization that led up to the Voting Rights Act and the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, there's a clear relationship between organized popular mobilization and the expansion of freedom, and especially freedom for those who have least of it. So if we're trying to chart a realistic course towards a fairer and more inclusive society, we have to be laser focused on trying to build organized citizen power and redevelop the sort of institutions that used to exist in our society to channel the voices of ordinary people and working people into the political process in constructive ways. And I'm happy to say more about that if you want.
Yeah, sure. Well, let's talk about, for example, economic power. You mentioned FDR. He famously said that necessitous men are not free men. And of course, He is the architect of the New Deal and also signed the National Labor Relations Act, which founded the NLRB in 1935. And yet here we are, almost 100 years later in the United States, where most workers lack bargaining power, face wage theft, and are unable to organize. Just look at the efforts to union bust at Amazon or Starbucks. So thinking about immediate ways to mitigate or even solve the labor exploitation problem, how can democratic action address this? And you made some reference to grassroots efforts that are sustained over time. What would it look like for workers to use democratic tools to transform their economic conditions and expand their freedom?
One of the more important stories that explains what's happened over the last 4 to 5 decades, really since Ronald Reagan took power in 1980, 1981, is the erosion of bargaining power, right? So we used to have a society in which fully 30% of American workers were unionized. We now have a society in which unionization rates are around 10%, 6% of the private sector workforce is unionized. And the United States is a tremendous outlier when it comes to comparable affluent democracies, right? In Canada, unionization rates are around 30%. In Northern Europe, it's way more than that. And when you look at societies in which working class folks earn decent salaries, have stable jobs, earn decent benefits, and have significant bargaining power, these just are societies in which union power has not been shredded to the extent that it was shredded in the United States. So one step that we need to take, and I think if you imagine our next Democratic candidate for office, right, I would love to see priority placed on rebuilding the power of organized labor. I would love to see priority placed on encouraging worker ownership in business. I would love to see priority placed on just beginning to rethink the shareholder first model that has come to dominate this particular iteration of corporate capitalism, which makes companies completely beholden to investors and gives workers very little voice. I mean, I'm actually sympathetic to bicameralism in corporate governance. We should think seriously about creating worker representation in a serious way on corporate boards and restructuring our tax incentives to encourage worker ownership and collective ownership in business. I can go on and on about some of the policy initiatives that I'd like to see, but a lot of them are really focused on trying to rebalance the distribution of power in our society. I mean, we clearly need serious campaign finance change. I would love to see a candidate run on a constitutional amendment, which would be widely popular, to get big money out of politics and begin rebalancing things in that way. Part of the story here clearly has to be about political parties. I mean, the Democratic Party has been hollowed out substantially over the last 4 to 5 decades. Political parties in the middle of the 20th century used to be vibrant membership organizations that provided constituent services, that channeled ordinary working class voices into the political process. The Democratic Party in particular has lost the ability to do that in many ways and needs to begin rebuilding itself, rebuilding its presence in rural constituencies, rethinking the way it speaks to and attracts working class voters in a serious way. So anyway, I could go on, but I'll stop there.
No, it's all good. You know, one question I have here about the Democratic Party is that I feel, since you already mentioned it, that the Democratic Party is hollowed out, and maybe the Democratic Party is, not the vehicle through which we reclaim power for people. But really what I'm trying to get at is that, so many people are looking for direction, and it's clearly not coming from the Democratic Party. So if you are an interested, curious, serious citizen, our primary mission on the show is to spark civic action. And actually, I'm going to quote you now from your book. You write, quote, "Democracy gives ordinary people powerful political tools with which to expand their freedoms or protect them from encroachment," end quote. So what are those tools in your mind? And in what ways can people wield them in order to expand and protect freedoms, collectively speaking, and maybe without the Democratic Party?
Unfortunately, we exist within a two-party system, right, in which it is very difficult for third parties to come in and compete. And political parties are really vital to the proper functioning of any democratic society. I mean, it's hard to tell a plausible story about how you can maintain meaningful democratic accountability without political parties that function at a fairly high level. And I mean, that's really the role that political parties play, is figuring out how to draw people into the political process and give voice to their constituent interests and translate those voices into meaningful policy agendas. So I do think that any plausible path to reform, certainly in the short term and even the medium term in our society, will run through the Democratic Party. And so I do think that getting more involved, even for citizens who are alienated from the Democratic Party right now, it is all the more important that people figure out where their local party organizations are, start showing up to meetings, start figuring out how to get on committees, and start getting their hands on the steering wheel such that the Democratic Party can be steered away from the recommendations of the kind of affluent consultant class and towards the sort of everyday needs and interests of ordinary people. So I do think that we can't skip that step, unfortunately.
I hear you. Well, let's talk about the fact that we are basically in a really unequal society. We're totally aware that we are in a regime, and for many decades, of concentrated power, whether economic or political. And if we take equal freedom seriously, let's say through the Democratic Party, we need to demand that democracy and the party that we choose to help us get through this really does give us power by people. How can democratic action redistribute political power? Like, what does it actually look like when citizens reclaim power from concentrated elites? Is it just that we have different policies, or is it something more?
I would say there are two things to emphasize here. We need policy change across a whole range of issues. We need to strengthen the social safety net. We need to expand access to healthcare. We need to strengthen collective bargaining rights. We need to encourage and provide tax incentives that encourage worker ownership in business, and all of these things, which can only happen legislatively. We also then have to rebuild the state's capacity to enforce and implement these laws. We have laws on the books that are meant to protect workers from union busting, from wage theft, from discrimination and harassment in the workplace. But all too often, those laws are not enforced. There's just heartbreaking literatures about wage theft in this country. You mentioned wage theft, right? The Economic Policy Institute was estimating something to the tune of $50 billion are stolen from workers. And when we talk about wage theft, we're talking about people who are paid less than the minimum wage, or people who are not given the overtime wages they deserve, or tips that are withheld from people illegally. And to enforce the laws that would protect workers' rights, you actually need a regulatory infrastructure. And for decades now, the Department of Labor has been starved of resources. So there's something like now 600 or so inspectors charged with policing abuses and investigating abuses across 165 million workers in the society. I mean, it's just woefully and heartbreakingly inadequate. So that the laws that exist on the books, if you don't have adequate state capacity, and of course the Trump administration has been aggressively pulling down and eviscerating our state's capacity to enforce both environmental regulations but labor laws. I mean, this is a administration that wraps himself in the sort of veneer of populist rhetoric. But when you look at what they're actually doing when it comes to the interests of working people, it's a grim story. So that's part of it. I've talked about policy change. I've talked about rebuilding state capacity. But then there's the bottom-up components. And this is where, I talk a lot about what I call countervailing power in the book. Unions are part of it, but unions aren't the whole story. I mean, in the middle of the 20th century, we also sustained a wide range of broad-based citizen organizations that were capable of mobilizing significant political influence. Theda Skocpol, who's a Harvard sociologist who I admire a lot, has a book called Diminished Democracy, in which she tells the story of the sort of atrophy of these civic organizations. But there's an interesting tidbit, for example, about the GI Bill. It's a really important piece of legislation that expanded opportunities for soldiers after World War II, paid for college tuitions, helped with home ownership. It's a real important vector for economic mobility. And it turns out that originally the versions of the GI Bill that were being considered by political elites were really ungenerous and meager. And it was only through the sustained activism of the American Legion, this broad, often conservative-leaning, mind you, but broad-based citizen organization that sort of beat down the doors of, figuratively speaking, of course, of legislators and got them to implement a far more generous and far more significant and transformative GI Bill. You've been asking about how citizens and citizen empowerment is part of the story, but it certainly is part of the story. In order to build counterpower, you have to find ways of drawing people into organizations that will channel their interests into the political process. And there's a lot of hopeful stuff going on in this respect. I mean, I think of organizations like the Debt Collective, for example, which are finding new ways of building solidarity, not among people who share workplaces, but people who share medical debt or educational debt, giving those people voice collectively to lobby for debt forgiveness, to engage in rent strikes that expose abuses in the for-profit colleges. Or I think about the tenants unions that are developing in places like Los Angeles, which are organizing renters to exercise collective power and fight back against rent increases and summary evictions. So there are different ways of imagining this, but the project of rebuilding bottom-up grassroots countervailing power is, I think, the most important project for our time. It's the only way to imagine a kind of sustained transformation of our politics for the better.
Right, right. Well, just for the listener, I wanted to reference that we did have 2 interviews with Theta Scotchball on the show, and we also had the Debt Collective on. And finally, I also want to point out that when Lena Khan was FTC commissioner, she looked at latent laws and enforced them and won a bunch of lawsuits. In fact, she won 90% of the lawsuits, including against Kroger's and their practices. All this to say, we do have the infrastructure. It's just not being enforced. And that's a really good reminder that there is an opportunity for democratic action in demanding enforcement from our elected officials and, of course, installing people who can do this, which, of course, is not going to happen in this administration. But for sure, we need to keep this in our pockets. We'll be back with Alex in just a moment, so stay with us. This episode's Civic Spark is a good one. One small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, when I first started Future Hindsight, I was climbing the big podcasting mountain all by myself. Every single day introduced a new question that needed an answer, and fast. That can be an overwhelming feeling when your to-do list just grows and grows with new tasks every day, and that list can take over your life pretty quickly if you're not careful. So, how can you find the right tool that not only helps you out, but simplifies everything? Because that can be such a game changer. For millions of businesses out there, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the United States. From household names like Skims and Rhode Beauty to fresh brands that are just getting started. So, if you want to get started, take the first step with your own design studio. With hundreds of ready-to-use templates, Shopify helps you build a beautiful online store to match your brand's style. Let's say you want to accelerate your content creation. No problem. Shopify is packed with helpful AI tools that write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your product photography. With so many great tools at your fingertips, you can get the word out as if you have an entire marketing team behind you. In just a few quick minutes, you can easily create email and social media campaigns wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. Shopify is your commerce expert, with world-class expertise in everything from managing inventory to international shipping to processing returns and beyond. So if you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. No matter how big you want to grow, Shopify gives you everything you need to take control and take your business to the next level. And that's what I love about Shopify. Turn your big business idea into cha-ching with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/hopeful. Go to shopify.com/hopeful. Shopify.com/hopeful. We also want to share about a podcast we know you'll enjoy. Here, listen in.
Malcolm Gladwell here. This season on Revisionist History, we're going back to the spring of 1988 to a town in northwest Alabama where a man committed a crime that would spiral out of control.
There was this joke that said that it was easier to get forgiveness in the Church of Christ for murdering somebody than it was to be divorced.
From Revisionist History, this is The Alabama Murders. Listen to Revisionist History, The Alabama Murders, wherever you get your podcasts.
And now, let's return to my conversation with Alex Zakaras. So this conversation, of course, would not be complete without addressing the long history of racism and racial hierarchy. And you mentioned the GI Bill, which, of course, was mostly inaccessible to Black service members. And also, of course, there's a huge history of redlining, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many egregious examples. And there are many theories on how to right the wrongs of the past and the present continued systemic problems. For example, reparations. But you argue that public schools should be the first place we should look for meaningful impact. Tell us why.
You know, in a way, there's so many different places you could start in this conversation. There's so many policy interventions that are necessary. You know, the United States is one of the very few OECD countries in which wealthy students get more public funding per capita than poorer students. There is a significant racial gap in our schooling right now. I mean, people assume that school desegregation, which was an important piece of the civil rights agenda, was broadly successful. It has not been, right? Schools are every bit as segregated now as they were in many areas back in the 1960s. And that has profound implications. Access to quality public education. I mean, there's so much research showing how important and transformative good education is in opening up opportunities for economic and social mobility and creating the foundations of social inclusion and self-respect. And our school system really fails in this respect. And the other thing is we know, because there's a lot of credible research that shows that investing in our public educational system, reducing class sizes, increasing teacher salaries, providing better mental health and counseling services, improving the quality of facilities, just makes a huge difference in educational outcomes and eventually in changing the entire arc of people's lives. Right? So one area that absolutely cries out for intervention is sort of massive investment in especially schools that enroll a high percentage of low-income students and a high percentage of racial minorities. And it's one of the levers that exists at our disposal. We know that it works. We just need the political will to do it. And we haven't had it in our society so far.
Right. There isn't the political will. I mean, everything that you're talking about right now, the most common criticism will be, how are we going to pay for this, right? Like this is almost, I don't know, it's a reflexive and kind of lazy take that economic redistribution or workplace democracy would stifle innovation and like essentially equating equal freedom with a big loss in prosperity for all. But you, in fact, tackle this question head on of how do we pay for this in your book. And you write that to pursue the common good, there must be shared sacrifice. So, of course, as we just mentioned, that we currently don't have the political will. But how can democracy become the vehicle for deciding what we owe each other? And, rewrite the social contract, let's say, to make the shared sacrifice something that we're all invested in?
That's a great question. And I think for one thing, it's worth remembering that our American society in the mid-20th century was a highly innovative and dynamic economy. But we sustained very high marginal tax rates on the wealthy. I mean, in excess of 80%. I mean, most Americans aren't aware of that, right? So we have succeeded in imposing highly progressive income taxes that generated a great deal of revenue to reinvest in widening opportunity for ordinary folks before. Our rates of taxation have come down. Our rates of taxing inheritance have come down. We aren't willing at present to countenance wealth taxes, which we should. We live in a society in which a small handful of billionaires controls such extraordinary wealth, fleets of mega yachts and private jets. At the same time, we have 750,000 people on any given night sleeping in the streets or in homeless shelters, and several million more either sleeping in their cars or on a friend's couch or in extended stay motels, but without the resources to actually pay rent and find a place to call home. I mean, the inequalities we're living with are so grotesque. We need to have a policy conversation about where the money will come from to begin righting this ship. But there are many different ideas out there. And I'm not a tax economist, but there are a lot of really smart ones who think that we can thoroughly overhaul our tax system without putting a real damper on innovation in our society, but in a way that would allow us to make the sorts of social investments that we need.
Well, this is also, of course, a time of opportunity because I think, in a large sense, for everybody around the country, the scales are falling off their eyes, even if they did believe in the president's words about making America great again and really, this populist veneer, as you call it, to deliver for everyday people and unrig the system. And I do think that people rightfully thought that that's a good promise. It is a good promise, to unrig the system for everyday people. So in your mind, what are the democratic opportunities right now? And you mentioned the movement for countervailing power. And I'm wondering, are there organizations that you can recommend, or is there a specific action that you think of that people should really engage in to make the policies that would make life more free for people actually a reality instead of just like a wish list? Medicare for all is the forever dream that will never be accomplished. I had a conversation with somebody recently who's in the healthcare industry. He goes, yes, this would be the solution, but it will never happen because the powers that stand in the way, like big insurance companies, are so deep-pocketed. They can just roll the lobby, against everyday people in the halls of power every day, all day.
Yeah, no, I despair about this myself sometimes, and one way I sometimes think about this is about crisis. There's credible research suggesting that in everyday politics, wealthy interests have a relatively easy time having their way, right? But in crisis politics, in moments of rupture or crisis where people, when you think about the Great Depression as one such moment, and, the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2008, 2009 was one such moment, a really profoundly missed opportunity for the left in this country when there was considerable hunger for change. And I think with the right leadership, we could have pushed through changes that seriously crimped the style of financial elites. But we didn't have the political will or leadership or organization that we needed in that moment. So there are opportunities. And unfortunately, I think the combination of the Trump administration's recklessness and cruelty and growing risks of climate catastrophe are going to usher in a series of crises, which are going to be difficult and lamentable, but which also are going to present opportunities for a more dramatic reset, opportunities which don't exist in the sort of everyday politics when most people aren't paying close attention and when the lobbyists basically have unlimited access quietly to the levers of power. So, unfortunately, I think it may take some kind of crisis to dislodge the current status quo, but I think we really need to begin, and of course we are doing this, many people are doing this now, laying the ideological groundwork and beginning to build the kinds of citizen engagement around inequality that will prepare us to seize such a moment should it arise.
Yeah, I definitely think that we need the theory in order to put it into practice and then see what works, what works best, and, rinse, repeat. So every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guest to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. So what's a good way to turn the insights that you've just shared with us into action?
Yes, I'm glad you asked. We're living through a moment of extraordinary danger for constitutional democracy in this country, and I feel like I should answer this question by bringing us back to this current reality, right? Political scientists who study democratic breakdown, not just here, but across the world, are very clear that the greatest threat to democracy in the 21st century is what they call executive aggrandizement. Elected executives who, once they come into power, start to pull down the infrastructures of liberal democracy, wear away at constitutional limits, undermine the rule of law, intimidate free media outlets, persecute political opponents, weaponize the justice system, right? All of the things that we see happening around us. So I think given the urgency of our threat right now, the highest obligation that we have as citizens is to figure out some way of joining this fight. And, a lot of people who listen to this podcast will have protested in peaceful protests already. And if you haven't, this is crucial. The research shows that broad-based popular protest is actually an important part of the recipe when we think about how authoritarian takeovers get defeated. But a lot of the people who have participated in peaceful protests are also asking, what comes next? When we finish protesting, we feel good and we want to maintain that momentum. What do we do next? And so this is what I would say in answer to your Civic Spark question. Look, we know from political scientists, I'm thinking of Erica Chenoweth's work, for example, that every would-be tyrant relies on a huge number of people to go along. Right? And these include powerful people in the business sector, in universities, in unions, in the faith community, in law firms, civil society influencers, you might say. People who are either going to help the autocrat or stand by or going to resist, are going to capitulate or not capitulate. And that turns out to make a huge difference in whether authoritarian takeovers are successful. So here's an action you can take. Identify a few leaders. It could just be your local mayor. It could be your union leader. It could be the president of the university you graduated from. It could be the leadership in your church. Leaders who have some reason to listen to you, and let them know that you expect them not to go along, that you expect them to resist and stiffen their spine, that you're looking for them to do what's right. And if they do, praise them for it. Let them know that you're paying attention. All right, and if you then want to move up to a more advanced level, figure out who you know who might also be willing to to bring pressure on these leaders and communicate with them and see if they're willing to start talking strategy as to how you can increase your impact. I mean, people are doing this all across the country. I was just reading about the group out in California called Educators Resist, where your public school teachers are getting together to try to resist the sort of gutting of history curricula in our schools, for example. There's all kinds of opportunities. And there's reason for hope, right? We've seen the Catholic bishops recently come out with a strong condemnation of the abuse and vilification of immigrants. We've seen the Indiana legislature just recently refusing to gerrymander its congressional districts at Trump's behest. We've seen the Chamber of Commerce suing the Trump administration about its H-1B visa policy, right? So this is where the action really is right now. And so to the extent that we as citizens can bring pressure and sustain pressure on some of these elite actors who have the power to resist, that's a really effective thing that we can do civically.
Yeah, all good advice and great examples. Last question. Looking into the future, what makes you hopeful about democracy's capacity to deliver radical liberalism?
Yeah, I mean, these are times, it's easy sometimes to feel like, hopeless and discouraged in this moment, yes. Right? There's so much great work happening at the local and regional level in this country. Innovators and change makers who've devoted their lives to trying to improve society, build countervailing power, create a more equitable future for us. I think, for example, of an organization called Project Equity. Their premise is to encourage retiring business owners to sell their business not to some other private owner, but to their workforce. So to convert their business into a worker-owned business. In the next decade, something like 3 million baby boomers are going to retire and sell their business. And many are not aware even of the option of selling it to their employees. And many employees don't have the technical advice or access to the financing that they would need to make this transition work. But this organization is doing that. It's stepping into that void, working with retiring business owners and facilitating that transition to worker-owned business. And worker-owned businesses, the data is clear, right? People's job satisfaction goes up, wages are higher, job security is higher. The likelihood that the business will up and leave the community and abandon it is much lower under worker ownership. So there are all kinds of good reasons to want this to be part of the economy that we're moving toward, a fairer, more humane, more inclusive economy. But so that's just one example. And there are many others that give me hope when I sort of drill down into the details of what change makers are doing on the ground every day.
Yeah, here. I totally agree with you. I've been doing this show for 8 years, and I have to tell you that one of the big sources of hope for me is speaking to citizen change makers who are truly committed to making life better for everyone. Alex, thank you so much for joining me on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, it was really a pleasure to be here too. Thanks so much for all the good work you do with the podcast and for having me on.
Alex Zakaras is professor of political science at the University of Vermont. His new book is Freedom for All: What a Liberal Society Could Be. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. As we continue to see the institutions of our liberal democracy being attacked and torn down, we must figure out a way to join the fight against these dangers. So, identify a few leaders around you, like a school board member or a faith leader. Reach out to them and let them know that you refuse to go along with the deliberate disintegration of our freedoms. Your voice is your resistance, and your resistance is the most important first step. Next week on Future Hindsight, we're joined by Rick Wilson. He's a renowned political strategist, political commentator, a New York Times bestselling author, and the co-founder of the Lincoln Project. He also hosts the Enemies List and the Lincoln Project podcasts. That's next time on Future Hindsight. Now, be sure to follow us on your podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. And if you're listening on your browser, you can find Future Hindsight on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcast app. We're here to build your civic action toolkit every week. So follow Future Hindsight now and we'll come right to you. And if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent pro-democracy podcast, please subscribe to the Civics Club on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/futurehindsight now to join. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zack, Travis, and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,